Good morning, everyone. I really love the theme of faith. Faith is such a dynamic word, and oftentimes it's reduced into a reactionary definition, a definition that ties itself to structures, to religious structures, to dogma, to things that are simply the container or the setup for an experience of faith or an experience that even dissolves faith. And I would like to break faith out of that prison. So, faith to me, from when I hear its usage in common parlance, seems to point in three directions. Sometimes when people are speaking about faith, they speak about an assent to an articulated belief. I think that's probably a more mainstream way to speak of faith. For instance, if you belong to a church, Catholic Church is a good one, there's a creed, and everyone says the creed, and the creed is the articulation of faith. And more or less, people within the tradition will really believe in the creed or not. Sometimes it's just saying the words. And there's not total fault with that. I find that sometimes I feel that in my walking in the presence of the divine that I'm going through the motions, moments when I'm separated from myself. So I don't necessarily look down on that. I'd rather be saying words that I don't quite believe that are pointing to goodness rather than words that I believe that are pointing to destruction or badness or anything like that. So oftentimes faith is seen as that. What's your faith? Well, I'm Catholic. I believe the creed. Well, I'm Buddhist. I believe this. Well, and so it has to do with a relationship to the articulation of an experience, not necessarily a relationship to the experience itself. And the second way is an assent to something that resonates. For instance, even on a very secular level, when you get on a plane, you have faith that the pilot is going to pilot the plane safely. And there's a certain resonance with that kind of goes with you. You can relax into that. That we can say in relation to the mystery of eternity, to the mystery of life source or God, that when our faith is dynamic, there's a certain surrendering into that's, yes, a mystery, because you don't know how to fly a plane yourself, probably, but there's a taste, a resonance, something within the fiber of you that is compelled to surrender with a relaxation, with a true trust. So that's another form of faith. And I think oftentimes in our lives, that's where we're at in our relationship, not to a belief system, but to our experience of the divine. That we're assenting to something that's so largely mystery, but something in us is like, I just can't get away from it. The third way to look at faith is faith as an articulation of a personal experience. And that to me is the most dynamic. Faith is, instead of being the portal to open us into the mystery, it becomes the overflow of expression as the mystery is experienced. And I would say that every tradition, that its inspired texts, the inspired texts were this third form. They were the attempted articulation of an experience. Even when the creed was defined in the Christian tradition in the 3rd century, the creed was an attempt to articulate an experience that was still very much alive little less than 300 years after, and that was an experience of Christ. So there was a dynamic quality there of how do we give words to this? But in giving the words itself, it's the setup, isn't it? Because then you assent into those words as the leading portal, the mystery. Lent is a perfect time to come into direct contact with where you are in your faith life today, in this moment. How would you articulate your faith? I mean, the faith that you live your life by. Whether it's a sensible experience, a mental experience, an emotional experience, a undefined spiritual experience, how would you speak to your faith? Because that articulation is meant to be dynamic. It's meant to change and change and change over and over and over again. Hence, that's why I said change so many times. And in that, then, the articulation stays alive. Where we as human beings always seem to live in a tension, in a paradox, is that once we have an experience, we seek to structure it or define it. And that's a good thing. We paint that as bad, oftentimes because of the inevitable fruits of it. But it's a good thing because it lets us ground and integrate the experience in our bodies, in our psyches. But what we want to do as we do that, as we articulate, is to stay very flexible around the articulation. And that is where the tension is, right? Because we want to be able to say certain words and have them be true all the time, for all eternity. We want to hit the absolute truth. And it's rare that we can find words that will be that relevant for us all our lives. There are certain words, I've got certain words that from my earliest childhood are still alive today. But they're still alive today because I allowed them to go through the destruction every time they fell short of the immediate experience of the divine. So that brings us then to this passage of Jesus that is so interesting. And he points again and again. He points to the fact that we can do things greater than him. That yes, look to him. He is the way because he's embodying the divine. And know that that is just meant to be transposed into us realizing ourselves as the way. And here in this passage with the mustard seed, he said, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed. Now, I have seen a seasonings jar of mustard seed, and I'm guessing that's what he means. And they're really tiny, tiny. They're like that tiny. He said, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to that mountain, rise up and move, and it would obey you. Faith leads us into a mastery in our lives where the universe conspires to obey us. That sounds self-centered, right? But it is the us that's devoid of the false forms of self. I love this definition of faith. Faith is neither a submission of the reason, nor is it the acceptance, simply and absolutely upon testimony of what reason cannot reach. Faith is the being able to cleave to a power of goodness, appealing to our higher and real self, not to our lower and apparent self. And that comes from a Literature and Dogma written by Matthew Arnold in 1873. You'll find that the word, as we have it and know it, did not exist before the Middle Ages, a little after that. But it had everything to do with trust and confiding in. So how then can we in this devotional this morning open ourselves in a new way, to experience the divine, that our articulation of faith may be relevant and dynamic. In that, I invite you to close your eyes. And I'm going to read a poem that I wrote that is a new experience of faith. I wrote it when I was walking the Camino this summer. And come into contact with your faith. If you will, let your faith be personified in some way or embodied or symbolized in some way. Is there some object, some entity that holds your sense of faith that you can look to, as though the faith is standing before you, or the faith is an object held in your hands? See if you can come into contact with a symbol or entity. And hold or be across from that faith with gratitude. Even if you know it falls short, it will always fall short of the experience. What I knew I could not say, but felt enormous things. Shadowy and blind, I dwelt for breaths of steamy gas in the lowest caverns of the senses, alighting into deepest transparency, combusting into breaths of fire. Awaken me, do it now, I beg you. That was penned by me and John of the Cross. Surrender today the dark, shadowy, blind places of yourself, not to a symbol or an entity or a church or a religion or an idea, but into the mystery to which they point. And this mustard seed, it will enliven your cells that you may be capable of moving mountains, which is not the goal, it's only the fruit. And when you're ready, I invite you to open your eyes and to walk your day in faith. Blessings, my friends.